Hi, I'm Maria Noel Groves, author of Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies and herbalist at Wintergreen Botanicals in New Hampshire. Today we're here with Mountain Rose Herbs and we're going to make an herb-infused honey. And there are a couple different ways that you can make herb-infused honey. One is a raw method, which is very similar to making a tincture or a basic maceration technique of an herbal oil, where you pretty much just put your herb in a jar, you cover it with honey. You can't shake it because honey doesn't exactly shake, but you would just, every day or so, you just turn it over and kind of keep doing that for about 2 weeks or so, and then strain out your honey after gently warming it up. But we're going to do a different technique that involves heat. There's a little bit of controversy around heat and honey. Certainly you do lose some of the properties, some of the healing properties of honey when you heat it, but in this case we're not really using honey itself for the healing properties. We're using it just because it's yummy and sweet, and we're going to be using the heat to extract the medicinal properties of the plants. And so some of the perks of this method over the raw method, one is that it is done in about 1 day or even within a couple hours, so you have it in a much shorter span of time. 2, you do a really nice job extracting healing properties out of the plants with that little bit of heat over the course of a few hours or so. And then 3, it is a little bit less apt to go bad because we're not introducing a lot of microbes, and even if we're working with fresh plant material, you'll evaporate off a lot of the moisture of that fresh plant, whereas if you make a raw honey with fresh plant material, you can do it, but they're really likely to go bad. They'll ferment over time, which could make something more like mead, but you're not controlling the fermentation process, so it could end up actually growing mold or other more unpleasant things. So this technique is one that I learned from herbalist Michael Moore when I went to school at the Southwest School of Botanical Medicine, and my very first herbal honey I ever made was with one of my favorite herbs, bee balm, which is a lot like oregano and thyme, kind of like a cross between those two medicinally, and I just did it like on a cook stove in the back of my trunk in the middle of like the woods, which was pretty awesome. But now I do it in a home cooking environment and it's a little bit easier to do. So we are going to do this with a dry plant today. We're going to do it with lavender, and this method works really well with aromatic plants. And so I'll do it with things like lavender. You can certainly do it with ginger, fresh or dry. You can do it with bee balm, oregano, thyme, Korean licorice mint, anise, hyssop. These are all herbs that I love to do via this method, fresh or dry. They taste so good. You can make them in herbal recipes, and you can also attain some of the healing properties of the plants when you take them. It's not as medicinally potent as making a tincture or a tea. Honey is not really that great of a solvent, but it's yummy, it's sweet, it can be very soothing on the throat, and so it's just really more of an enjoyable remedy that has a little bit of healing properties of the plants at the same time. So I'm just going to measure out a little bit. You want about 1/4 or so of a part for your plant material and about 2 parts for your herb. So if you had like a 1/4 cup to a 1/2 cup of herb and then 2 cups of honey would be about right, but really I almost never really measure. It's more about putting the herbs in the pot and then covering it with honey, and that will work out just fine. But if you want a recipe, you could say 1 part to 4 parts, or you can do a 1/2 cup of herb material to 2 cups of honey. So I'm just going to eyeball this. So we're going to do about 1/4 or so, 1/5 or so of what's in here. And then we'll put that in our pot. I'm not going to turn the pot on yet because we're not trying to fry our herbs or toast our herbs. We're going to cover it with honey. Honey is so slow. It's a good practice in patience getting it out. And you really want to try to avoid wasting honey as much as possible, because it takes, in a bee's life, they only make about 1/4 or 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in their lifespan. So I really try to treat this very respectfully and try not to waste it. And so I'll show you later on as we go to strain it out some ways to preserve so that we don't waste the honey that ends up on the sides of the jar. We can make some yummy sweet teas out of that. So you could just kind of sit here and wait for it to all come out. I think this is fine for now. We'll use this little bit of honey for something else later on as it collects. Also, another thing to keep in mind about honey is their weight and volume is a little bit different. So if you had a cup of, or 8 ounces of water, it would be about 8 ounces by volume and about 8 ounces by weight. In the case of honey, it's actually a lot heavier than it takes up in volume, and honey is usually sold by weight. So if you have a 32-ounce jar of honey by how it's labeled, it's not actually a quart in volume. It's a little less than that. It's closer to about 20 ounces. So if you were doing this method and you're like, oh, I've got making wedding favors and I want to fill 200 1-ounce jars with honey, and you go to make your recipe and you did it with measuring by the weight of it, you would actually end up quite a bit short, like a third short of what you were aiming for. And that's not even accounting for what ends up kind of left on the sides of the jar that just never quite comes out. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you can kind of fudge it and throw a little bit more in there, or actually do the calculation. So for about 30 ounces of honey by weight, you'll end up with about 20 ounces of honey by volume. And then keep in mind that you will lose some of that on the sides of jars that you can regain by making tea with it, but it probably isn't going to end up in your finished product. That only really matters if you're trying to make a set amount of jars of a set size, but if you are doing that, that's something to keep in mind. So we're going to bring this up to temp, and we have to be really careful that we don't overheat our honey. Honey has a way of boiling over really easily, and when it does, it really does ruin it. You know, like I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of controversy over whether or not it's okay to heat honey. There are some concerns that it may even form some toxic compounds. I'm not particularly concerned about that, but it is on par with like heating any other sugary substance, where it's not really quite as healthy once you've done that. But if you let it boil over, it actually burns the honey, and then it just doesn't taste good. It doesn't look good. It's not as nice. So we want to be careful that we don't do that. So I'm just going to kind of stir this up carefully. And of course, at first, things just don't really mix in. You see that the herbs kind of more sitting on top of the honey than really totally covered by it. But as we stir it and it gradually comes up to temp, then it will get a little bit more liquidy. And so we've got these big, that's right there. And we will just kind of keep going with that. And you're going to want to keep an eye on it. Let it come to where it seems like it's almost about to boil, and then shut it off, and just keep repeating that. Honey boils at a pretty low temperature. It's definitely below 200. It varies a little bit depending upon the honey itself, because honey is not a totally exact substance from one batch to another, but it boils at a pretty low temperature, and so most of our cooking equipment gets hotter than that. If you have a yogurt maker, those usually set at around like 95 to 100 degrees, and that is below honey's boiling temperature. So you could easily do this method in that kind of a setting, or you could put it in a jar and put it in your car for a little while, because your car on a warm sunny day is probably right about 100 degrees. You'll want to put it in a bag or something so you don't leak stickiness everywhere. So there are a lot of ways that you could play around with this, but if you're using a heating unit like this or a crock pot, then you just have to keep turning it on and off and being really mindful that it doesn't boil over. So we'll let that kind of do its thing for a little bit. It's getting a little softer. So we're getting just about ready to take this off the temp, and this is about what it's going to look like at that stage. You'll start to see almost like really tiny bubbles throughout it, but it's not actually really actively boiling much yet. And that's about where you want to take it off the heat, let it cool down, and then just do this repeatedly a couple times throughout the day. And you can easily do this when you're, doing other things in the kitchen, as long as you can keep an eye on it, but maybe at breakfast time, you put it on for a little bit, remove it from heat. You can leave it uncovered, so especially for fresh plant material, it gives a chance for that moisture to evaporate. But if, let's say, it's cooled down and you're going off to work for the day, you can just put a lid on it so, no little bugs or things get into it while you're gone. And then at night, come back, heat it up again, and then on the very last heating is when we're going to strain that out. But we're not quite ready to do that yet. We're going to let it cool, and then we'll heat it up at least one more time for this video today, but you can do it repeatedly a couple times. For something really aromatic, heating it up just a little bit, a few times is great. If it's something that is tougher, like maybe cinnamon sticks, you could do it over the course of a couple days, and that time, even as it's sitting in the cold honey, that time is going to give a little more chance to pull those flavors out. But for something really quick and aromatic, like holy basil or lavender, you can easily make a beautiful, delicious herbal honey in just a couple hours. So I think we're just about ready to go. We've reheated it a little bit more, and it's got a nice strong flavor. So we're just going to remove that from the heat. It's important to do this step while it's still really warm, because it's going to be a lot easier to strain at that stage. And we're just going to take this strainer here and carefully strain it through and try to get as much honey as possible separate from the lavender. Whoop. And if you happen to have it, having a bigger strainer is really helpful for this, but this just happens to be the biggest one that I have to work with right now. And we'll give that time to work its way through. So I'd say we're just about good for the moment, and we only got a little bit of honey out of this batch because we did a pretty small batch, but we do have a lot of honey just kind of left on our pot and our strainer that, you know, we just hate to waste that. And so here's a way that you can use that up and make something really delicious in the process. And it also is going to help you with your cleaning process. So just cover all that up with some water, and you're basically going to make a tea, a nice sweet tea. And we'll heat that up so it's nice and hot, and then we'll strain it out, and then you can enjoy that as a sweet tea, and then you can also make iced teas with it. If you're doing any fermentation projects, you might be able to incorporate this into that as well, but mostly we're using it as like an iced tea or a sweet tea. And you can just play around with it and have a lot of fun. You can make nice cocktails with it, but it does only keep for maybe a couple days tops in the refrigerator, so it's something you're gonna wanna drink pretty quickly. So now that we have a really nice tea here, we're just gonna strain it out, and then you can enjoy that as a beverage. So we're gonna strain it out the same way that we strained out the herbal honey. But now all that really nice, lovely honey, all the hard work of those bees, we're gonna get to enjoy, and we're not gonna be wasting. And then we can just compost whatever's left of the herb material. This would be really nice on the skin as well. So that's how you make an herb-infused honey. A couple different methods. I hope you enjoy it, and happy herbal adventures.